Putnam got off his great line, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," which was very good advice for people firing an American musket, because it couldn't hit anything unless you could see the whites of the guy's eyes.
Over 1,100 British soldiers are killed or wounded on Breed's Hill. Both sides know there is no turning back now. In Philadelphia, at a meeting of the self-appointed Continental Congress, Boston lawyer John Adams nominates a Southern plantation owner to be commander-in-chief of the spontaneously forming Continental Army. His name is George Washington.
He was the revolution. He was a man who had presence. He just walked into a room and everyone stopped and looked at him. He was very tall for that day, about 6'3", but in that time that made him a giant.
As Washington takes command of the Continental Army at Boston, a Connecticut merchant, Benedict Arnold, joins a daring raid on the British fort of Ticonderoga, a raid that freed vital cannon for the American cause. Arnold goes on to lead a starvation winter march into the Maine and Canadian wilderness, with the intent of making Canada a rebel colony. He nearly succeeds in taking the fortress city of Quebec, the key to Canada.
The Americans came that close to making Canada the 14th colony, and if they had, it would have been Arnold's doing.
The great American statesman, 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin, returns from a decade-long diplomatic mission in England to become the oldest revolutionary. He helps Thomas Jefferson draft the Declaration of Independence in mid-1776, but becomes irrevocably estranged from his son, William, who remains loyal to the king.
Franklin and his son spent a whole night discussing the prospects of the revolution and emptying many bottles of Madeira in the process. After this, the two men did not talk anymore until after the revolution.
The British transport an army of over 30,000 men to New York City. There, in the last half of 1776, Washington and his ill-trained forces are routed in battle after battle.
Anybody who had New York was in a very good position to win the war, and the British could see that, so could Washington.
In desperation, Washington and his army flee into the Pennsylvania countryside. The British control New York, its harbor, and the vital Hudson River. America's hopes are never fainted.
Passion governs, and she never governs wisely.
The colonies are not to be emancipated.
All men are created equal, victory or death.
The Battle of Trenton is a part of one of the most magnificent campaigns of the American Revolution. The 10 days at Christmas, 1776. If Washington had done nothing before or nothing after, those 10 days would have guaranteed him a spot in all of our history books.
Necessity, dire necessity. will, nay must, justify my attack. Victory or death. George Washington before Trenton.
On Christmas night of 1776, Washington led 2,400 of his dwindling army to the banks of the Delaware River. He planned to cross the river and attack the enemy-held town of Trenton, New Jersey. His men were Army regulars, not militia. By now, Washington was convinced that only a standing army could meet and defeat trained British forces, an army, he said, that would look the enemy in the face.
It is fearfully cold and raw, and a snowstorm setting in. The wind is northeast and beats in the faces of the men. It will be a terrible night for the soldiers who have no shoes. Some of them have tied old rags around their feet. Others are barefoot, but I have not heard a man complain. Colonel John Fitzgerald, Christmas, 1776.
John Glover's Marbleheaders, the same group that saved Washington's army through a daring nighttime evacuation from Brooklyn to Manhattan just 4 months earlier, saw to the dangerous task of ferrying the Continentals across the icy Delaware.
Glover's men have had a hard time to force the boats through the floating ice with the snow drifting in their faces. I have never seen Washington so determined as he is now. He is calm and collected, but very determined. Colonel John Fitzgerald.
The crossing took longer than expected. They still had 9 hard miles to cover in order to surprise the enemy before dawn. Surprise was possible in no small part because of the work of John Honeyman, a spy of Washington's who had infiltrated the British-paid German mercenaries, commonly called Hessians.
Throughout the war, I should add, Washington was his own spy master. He ran all kinds of spy rings inside the British Army and inside the British cities like New York and Philadelphia. But Trenton was his masterpiece. And Honeyman went into Trenton and befriended the German commander. His name was Johann Rall. And Honeyman told Rall, "Oh, I've been over on the other side of Delaware. Washington's army is falling apart. There's nothing left. He's gone. You know, there's nothing. Don't worry about the Americans. Have another drink, Colonel," and so forth. Honeyman, meanwhile, would get back to Washington and give him a complete breakdown of every move the Hessians were making, the disposition of all their sentries, the whole operation of this Hessian outpost there at Trenton.
At 7:30 in the morning, in a sleet storm, the American forces surprised the Hessians, still groggy from their Christmas festivities.
There are probably no troops, British, Hessian, or Loyalists, that would have stood against the Americans at Trenton. They were caught totally by surprise. They were disorganized, and they really didn't know what was going on. Plus, the weather was bad, and it was hard to fire their muskets.
The Hessian commander, spent after a Christmas night of drinking and gambling, tried to rally his troops.
We could hear him shouting in German, "My brave soldiers, advance!" His men were frightened and confused, for our men were firing upon them from fences and houses, and they were falling fast. It was not long before Rall tumbled from his horse, and his soldiers threw down their guns and gave themselves up as prisoners. Colonel John Fitzgerald.
Mortally wounded, Rall surrendered his sword to Washington. The American commander took 900 Hessian prisoners.
This was the victory that Americans had to have in order to turn the whole thing around. It went through the spirits of American colonies like an electric shock, you know, all the way from Carolina to Boston. The news went out that we'd won one, finally.
4 days after Trenton, Washington made an emotional appeal to the disintegrating core of his army, the Continental Regulars, who had actually enlisted for service, rather than simply volunteering as militiamen. For many, Their one-year enlistment would end